Every civilization that rises eventually falls. We're taught this as historical lore. Rome fell, Egypt declined, the Maya collapsed. Great powers emerge, flourish, and crumble in cycles as predictable as the seasons. But we're never taught what actually causes collapse. Not really. We get lists of contributing factors: economic strain, military overreach, environmental degradation, political corruption, vague explanations that describe symptoms without identifying causes. What if the greatest collapse in human history happened not through gradual decline but through catastrophic failure? What if a civilization more advanced than our own didn't slowly fade but suddenly broke? What if the Tartarian world ended not with a whimper but with a catastrophe so profound that the survivors had to erase all memory of what came before? I've spent years assembling evidence of Tartarian technology: the atmospheric energy systems, the free power that flowed through spires and domes, the sophisticated infrastructure that connected cities across continents, the advanced understanding that made their civilization possible. But technology that powerful comes with risks equally powerful. Systems that tap into planetary energy operate at scales where failure isn't local, it's global. This investigation examines what the evidence suggests about how the Tartarian world ended. Not the slow decline of conventional historical collapse, but something far more sudden and far more devastating: the Great Atmospheric Collapse, the moment when Tartarian engineers lost control of the systems that powered their civilization, and the world as they knew it ended. Let me start with what we know about Tartarian energy technology. The evidence suggests a civilization that harvested electrical energy directly from the atmosphere. The spires and domes and antenna systems visible on Tartarian buildings weren't decorative. They were functional components of a global energy network. This technology tapped into forces we barely understand: the electrical potential difference between Earth and upper atmosphere, the telluric currents flowing through the planet's crust, the resonant frequencies of the Earth's electromagnetic field. The Tartarians didn't generate power the way we do. They didn't burn fuel or split atoms. They collected energy that already existed, flowing naturally through planetary systems. They inserted themselves into circuits of cosmic scale. This approach has obvious advantages: no fuel costs, no pollution, no depletion of resources, energy available anywhere the collection infrastructure existed, power that flowed as freely as sunlight. But it also has obvious risks, risks that become clear when you think about what they were actually doing. Consider the scale of forces involved. The electrical potential between Earth's surface and the ionosphere measures hundreds of thousands of volts. Lightning strikes demonstrate the power waiting to discharge between these layers. Each bolt carries billions of joules of energy. The Tartarian system apparently provided controlled pathways for this energy. The spires and domes created circuits that allowed atmospheric electricity to flow to ground in useful ways rather than catastrophic discharges. But maintaining control over forces of this magnitude requires perfect functioning of every component. A lightning rod works because it provides an easier path than surrounding structures. If it fails, lightning doesn't stop. It just finds another path, often through something not designed to handle it. Now scale this up to a global infrastructure. Thousands of collection points across continents, all interconnected, all managing the flow of planetary electrical energy. What happens if part of that system fails? The historical record contains evidence of a global catastrophe occurring sometime in the early to mid-19th century. The mudflood evidence we've documented in previous investigations points to massive ground-level changes across the world. Cities buried under meters of sediment, first floors becoming basements, streets rising dramatically. The climate disruptions of 1816 and surrounding years indicate atmospheric disturbance on a planetary scale, temperature anomalies that don't match simple volcanic explanations, weather patterns disrupted across continents simultaneously, the population dislocations, the institutional construction boom, the orphan trains and asylum expansions all suggest a civilization managing the aftermath of something catastrophic. But what was the catastrophe? What could affect the entire planet simultaneously? The atmospheric energy system provides an answer. Imagine a network designed to manage global electrical flows, collection points on every continent, distribution systems connecting major population centers, the entire planet wired into a single energy grid. Now imagine a cascading failure in that system. It might start small: a single collection point malfunctioning, a spire damaged, a dome's resonant frequency shifted by structural change. In a localized power system, local failure causes local problems. A power plant goes offline, and nearby areas lose electricity, inconvenient but contained. But the Tartarian system wasn't localized. It was planetary. Each component existed within a global circuit. Each collection point affected the behavior of every other collection point. A failure in one location would change electrical flows everywhere. Other collection points would experience increased load, Some would compensate successfully, others might be pushed beyond their design parameters, and then those points would fail, creating more load shifting, more compensation demands, more potential failures. The cascade would accelerate, each failure making the next more likely. The system that had maintained controlled energy flow across the planet would fragment into chaos. The atmospheric effects of such a collapse would be catastrophic, uncontrolled electrical discharge on a massive scale. Not individual lightning strikes, but sustained energy release across entire regions, the sky itself becoming a discharge zone. The immediate effects would include electromagnetic disruption of unprecedented scale. Any technology dependent on electrical systems would fail, communication would cease, transportation would halt, the infrastructure of civilization would collapse simultaneously. But the longer-term effects would be worse. Massive electrical discharge into the atmosphere would alter atmospheric chemistry, ozone formation and destruction would be affected. The composition of the upper atmosphere would change. This could explain the climate anomalies of the 1816 period far better than volcanic eruption. Not particulates blocking sunlight, but atmospheric chemistry altered by unprecedented electrical events. Not gradual cooling from ash distribution, but sudden disruption of the systems that regulate planetary temperature. The ground-level changes we call the mud flood might also result from atmospheric collapse. This sounds counterintuitive. How would atmospheric events cause ground-level burial? But consider what happens when massive electrical discharge meets water vapor. Rapid precipitation on an unprecedented scale. Not normal rain, but walls of water descending simultaneously across vast areas. The floods wouldn't come from rivers overflowing. They would come from the sky itself, releasing water accumulated in ways that no longer functioned normally. Now add electrical effects on soil. Large-scale current flow through the ground could liquefy certain soil types. Areas that were stable could suddenly become fluid. Structures could sink into ground that briefly behaved like liquid. The burial might not have been deposition from floods moving sediment from elsewhere. It might have been liquefaction causing buildings to sink into ground that temporarily lost its structural integrity. This would explain why buried buildings often show minimal flood damage to their above-ground portions. They weren't inundated by flowing water carrying debris. They sank into ground that briefly couldn't support them, then solidified again at a new equilibrium. The human cost of such an event would be staggering. Population centers were presumably located near major energy collection points. The cities with the grandest Tartarian architecture, the most sophisticated infrastructure, would also have been closest to the systems that failed catastrophically. The immediate deaths from electrical discharge, structural collapse, and flooding would be enormous, but the aftermath would be worse. With the energy system destroyed, everything that depended on it would cease functioning. The agricultural systems we discussed in the previous investigation would fail. The heating and cooling that made buildings habitable would stop. The transportation network that connected cities would become inoperable. Survivors would face a world where nothing worked the way it had. Technology that had seemed like permanent features of existence would suddenly be useless. Knowledge of how to live without that technology would have atrophied across generations of abundance. The death toll wouldn't be measured in thousands or millions. It would be measured in percentages of global population, perhaps the majority of humans alive at the time of collapse. The evidence of mass death appears in the demographic record, though disguised. Population estimates for the early 19th century are remarkably uncertain. Different sources give wildly different figures. The data simply doesn't exist to establish baseline populations with confidence. This uncertainty itself is evidence. Detailed records existed for earlier periods. Why would record-keeping suddenly become unreliable precisely when something catastrophic might have happened? The orphan trains and asylum populations we've discussed before take on new significance. These weren't just witnesses to historical discontinuity. They were survivors. Children who had lost families, communities, entire worlds. Adults who couldn't function in the new reality because they remembered the old one. The scale of institutional response makes sense if the institutions were processing survivors of civilizational collapse, not managing normal populations experiencing normal difficulties, but handling the human remnants of catastrophe. The survivors who rebuilt would have faced impossible choices. They possessed fragments of Tartarian knowledge, but not complete understanding. They could see that the technology had failed catastrophically. They might not have known exactly why or how to prevent recurrence. The safest course would be to avoid repeating the experiment, to suppress the knowledge of atmospheric energy technology, to ensure that no one would attempt to rebuild the systems that had failed so devastatingly. This explains the systematic erasure we've documented. Not mere historical revisionism, but existential caution. The technology was too dangerous. The memory of it had to be eliminated. The witnesses who remembered the old world weren't just inconvenient. They were dangerous. They might try to rebuild. They might share knowledge that could lead to another catastrophic failure. They had to be silenced, not from malice, but from fear. The new civilization that emerged would be built on different principles. Instead of tapping planetary energy systems, it would rely on localized power generation, burning fuel that could be controlled, creating electricity in contained systems that couldn't cascade globally. This approach is less efficient. It requires constant input. It produces pollution and depletion, but it's safer. Local failures remain local. The worst that happens is a blackout, not a civilizational collapse. The Industrial Revolution wasn't progress from primitive to advanced. It was deliberate regression from dangerous sophistication to safer simplicity. The choice of steam and coal over atmospheric electricity wasn't ignorance of alternatives. It was rejection of alternatives known to be catastrophically risky. But the architects of the new civilization had learned a terrible lesson. Power that comes too easily from systems too vast to fully control carries risks that outweigh its benefits. Better to struggle with primitive technology than risk another collapse. This interpretation explains anomalies in technological history that otherwise make no sense. Why did the Industrial Revolution proceed so slowly when the principles of electricity were already known? The technology was being deliberately limited. Development that might lead toward atmospheric energy systems was discouraged or suppressed. Why did certain research directions face inexplicable resistance? Not because they wouldn't work, but because they might work too well, might lead back toward the dangerous technologies that had caused collapse. Why do we still not have free energy despite over a century of electrical development? Because the path toward free energy leads toward atmospheric collection, and that path is blocked, not by physics, but by policy, by the inherited caution of people who remembered what happened when those systems failed. The Tartarian engineers who lost control weren't incompetent. They had built a civilization of unprecedented sophistication. Their technology worked, probably for generations or centuries. The systems that failed had functioned successfully long enough for entire societies to develop around their capabilities. The failure was likely not a design flaw, but an unexpected event, something that hadn't happened before and therefore couldn't have been planned for. Perhaps solar activity exceeding historical ranges, a coronal mass ejection of unprecedented scale disrupting the delicate balance of atmospheric electrical systems, perhaps geological shifts affecting the Earth's electromagnetic field, earthquakes, or volcanic events changing the parameters within which the collection systems operated. Perhaps something else entirely, some factor in cosmic or planetary systems that varies on timescales longer than civilizations typically track, a 1,000-year cycle hitting its catastrophic phase. The engineers may have understood their systems perfectly within normal parameters. They simply couldn't anticipate parameters that had never occurred within their civilization's memory. The evidence of solar involvement appears in multiple sources. The Carrington event of 1859, the largest recorded geomagnetic storm, caused telegraph systems worldwide to fail. Operators received electrical shocks, telegraph pylons threw sparks. Systems continued operating even when disconnected from batteries, powered by induced current alone. This was a solar event affecting a primitive electrical infrastructure. Imagine such an event hitting a sophisticated global network designed to collect and distribute atmospheric electricity. The 1859 event happened after the proposed collapse date, but it demonstrates the type of solar activity that could affect planetary electrical systems. Similar or larger events in earlier decades could have interacted catastrophically with Tartarian infrastructure. Historical records from the early 19th century contain references to unusual auroral activity, northern lights visible at southern latitudes, atmospheric phenomena that don't match normal patterns, saw evidence of solar activity affecting Earth's electrical environment. The geological evidence is equally suggestive. The early 19th century saw significant seismic activity worldwide. The 1811 to 1812 New Madrid earthquakes in North America were among the largest ever recorded on the continent. They permanently altered the landscape, created new lakes, and affected territories far beyond the epicenter. Earthquakes on this scale would affect the Earth's electromagnetic field. They would change the parameters that any system harvesting telluric currents would depend on. A network designed for one set of geological conditions would malfunction when those conditions suddenly changed. The mud flood evidence includes what appears to be liquefaction damage, ground that behaved abnormally. Structures sinking or shifting in ways that suggest temporary loss of soil stability. Major earthquakes cause liquefaction in susceptible soils, but the global extent of apparent liquefaction exceeds what any single earthquake could explain, unless the earthquakes themselves were triggered by something larger, unless whatever disrupted the atmospheric electrical system also affected geological stability. The possibility of deliberate sabotage cannot be excluded. Every powerful technology creates winners and losers. The Tartarian energy system presumably had had its opponents, those who benefited less from its operation, those who saw opportunity in its failure. What if the collapse wasn't entirely accidental? What if parties who stood to gain from Tartarian failure found ways to trigger or accelerate system breakdown? The new civilization that emerged from the collapse clearly benefited certain interests. The industrial system that replaced Tartarian technology concentrated power and wealth in specific hands. The pharmaceutical medicine that replaced Tartarian healing approaches created profitable dependencies. The labor-intensive economy that replaced Tartarian automation ensured ongoing control over populations. Were these the architects of collapse, or simply opportunists who took advantage of catastrophe? The evidence doesn't clearly distinguish, but the systematic suppression of Tartarian knowledge suggests more than simple forgetting. It suggests active management, someone ensuring that the old ways couldn't return. Whether they caused the collapse or merely benefited from it, they certainly worked to ensure it remained permanent. The atmospheric effects of the collapse may still persist. The climate has never fully recovered to pre-collapse conditions. We're told this is natural variation or recent human impact. But what if the baseline we consider normal is actually degraded? What if the atmosphere still carries damage from events over 2 centuries ago? The increasing instability we observe in weather patterns might not be new developments. They might be ongoing consequences of ancient damage, systems that never fully rebalanced after catastrophic disruption. The Tartarian atmospheric technology apparently worked with natural planetary systems. Its operation presumably required those systems functioning within certain parameters. Its failure may have pushed those parameters beyond their stable range. We might be living in the long tail of a catastrophe we don't remember, experiencing effects we can't attribute because we've forgotten the cause. The technology to rebuild exists. Everything the Tartarians accomplished remains technically possible. The physics hasn't changed. The planetary energy systems still flow. The atmospheric electricity still accumulates. The potential to harvest it still exists. What doesn't exist is the will, or rather what exists is active resistance. Research into atmospheric energy collection faces inexplicable obstacles. Funding disappears. Results get classified. Researchers face career consequences for pursuing certain directions. This resistance is usually attributed to physics. The technology simply doesn't work. The laws of thermodynamics prevent free energy. The dream of atmospheric power is perpetual motion fantasy, but the Tartarian evidence challenges this dismissal. The technology worked once. The buildings that remain prove sophisticated engagement with forces we claim are unusable. The resistance isn't physics, it's policy, the inherited caution of a civilization that learned what happens when such technology fails. Should we try to rebuild? This question haunts everyone who investigates Tartarian technology seriously. The potential benefits are enormous. Free energy would transform human civilization. It would end poverty, halt environmental destruction, and unlock possibilities we can barely imagine. But the risks are equally enormous. If the Tartarian collapse resulted from the technology itself, rebuilding it invites repeating the catastrophe, another cascade failure. Another global collapse, another dark age that might not end as well as the last one. The caution that has suppressed this technology might be wisdom rather than conspiracy. The refusal to pursue atmospheric energy might reflect hard-won knowledge about risks we've forgotten, or it might reflect control interests that simply don't want humanity to have access to free power. The difficulty is distinguishing genuine caution from self-interested suppression. The truth probably lies somewhere between. The collapse was real. The catastrophe was genuine. The technology did fail in ways that devastated civilization, but the response has exceeded what simple caution requires. The systematic erasure of all Tartarian knowledge, the complete suppression of historical memory, the determined effort to ensure humanity never learns what was lost. These suggest interests beyond safety. If the concern were purely preventing another collapse, education would serve better than suppression. Teaching what went wrong would help future generations avoid repeating the mistake. Hiding the mistake ensures future generations might stumble into it blindly. The suppression protects something beyond public safety. It protects power structures that depend on controlled energy, economic systems that require artificial scarcity, social arrangements that collapse if abundance becomes possible. The collapse was real. The continued suppression is manipulation. Understanding what happened offers a path forward. The Tartarian engineers lost control because they didn't fully understand the systems they were working with. They built technology that exceeded their comprehension. When unexpected conditions arose, they couldn't respond appropriately. We have advantages they lacked: modern scientific understanding of solar activity, geological processes, and atmospheric physics exceeds what the Tartarians likely possessed. We could potentially build safer systems, systems with fail-safes, systems designed to degrade gracefully rather than cascade catastrophically. The question is whether we'll be allowed to try. The interests that benefit from suppression haven't disappeared. The power structures that depend on controlled energy remain entrenched. The gatekeepers who prevent research in dangerous directions still control funding and publication. But knowledge spreads despite suppression. The evidence of Tartarian technology accumulates. The understanding of what they built and why it failed becomes clearer with each investigation. Eventually, someone will try to rebuild. The temptation of free energy is too great to resist forever. The question is whether that attempt will be informed by understanding of past failure or blind repetition of ancient mistakes. The great atmospheric collapse ended the Tartarian world. Engineers who thought they understood their systems discovered they didn't. Technology that had worked for generations suddenly failed. The failure cascaded globally, affecting every continent simultaneously. The civilization that depended on that technology collapsed with it. The survivors built something new on the ruins, something safer but also lesser, something controlled by those who understood that abundance was dangerous, at least dangerous to their power. We've inherited that lesser world. We've been told it's the best we can do. We've accepted limitations that aren't physics, but policy. We've forgotten that another way is possible, but the evidence remains. In the buildings that harvested energy we're told can't be harvested. In the infrastructure of a civilization more sophisticated than our own. In the fragments of knowledge that survived suppression and wait to be reassembled. The Tartarians reached higher than we've been allowed to reach. They fell further than we've been told anyone ever fell. Their collapse shapes our world in ways we're only beginning to understand, and their technology remains waiting. The question isn't whether humanity will reach for atmospheric energy again. The question is whether we'll be wiser this time. Whether we'll learn from what happened when Tartarian engineers lost control. Whether we'll build systems that can't cascade. Whether we'll understand what we're working with before we switch it on. The great atmospheric collapse happened once. It doesn't have to happen again, but only if we remember. Only if we understand. Only if we learn from the greatest catastrophe in human history. The catastrophe we've been taught to forget.